My first animation tests were devoted to dinosaurs. They were my passion. I chose a cave bear, I think, to simplify it. I had him back in my mind to do a film called Evolution, showing the history of the world, and I thought I would start with the cave bear as a series of tests. My first camera I borrowed from a friend of mine. It was an old Victor camera. It didn't have a one-frame shaft on it, so you could take one picture at a time. And I had to tap it quickly and hope that I only got one frame. Sometimes I got two, sometimes I got three, which made the animation very jerky. But in getting the rushes back, I found it rather fascinating to see this creature moving by itself. I think the first dinosaur I made was an Eriops, and then I graduated to the Stegosaurus, and I was very proud of it. After I'd met Willis O'Brien, he said, "You know, your Stegosaurus's legs look like sausages. You better study anatomy." The following scenes were tests I made on 16mm film of my rather ambitious project, Evolution, which was started in 1938. The concept was never completed, but the test footage enabled me to show what I could do for a feature-length project. I first considered the adventures of Baron Munchausen way back in my amateur days, just after finishing the Mother Goose stories. I had just discovered the wonderful illustrations of the story by French artist Gustave Doré. The travels of the outrageous Baron seemed ideal for a fantasy film and a natural for stop-motion animation. Although I had played around with various ideas for the storyline, it was not until about 1949-1950 that I produced several short step outlines and a set of visualizations. As his first adventure, I chose the Baron's fantastic visit to the moon. I realized the project would be a major undertaking and asked Charlotte Knight to help me develop a suitable storyline. While she was doing that, I modeled a figure of the mendacious Baron for sketching purposes. I also prepared a series of continuity sketches for some test scenes. There was to be dialogue involved, so I made some experiments with a pliable rubber face. This special rubber head possessed small levers with which I was able to produce a smile or a frown and other various expressions through the stop-motion process. This was the first time I experimented with 16mm rear projection. The scene depicts a conversation between the Baron and a giant who runs a cheese factory on the moon. Unfortunately, the final film was never produced or the soundtrack recorded. I actually found this process much too complicated. In the late 1940s, when I was considering possible unusual projects, Edgar Allan Poe stories came to mind. The tales were outrageous, but I felt that they would be interesting in a stylized visual. However, I only made one drawing depicting the exterior of the fall of the House of Usher. Little Googie was a charming clown I wanted to develop into a sequence for a film. I even constructed an animation model and made a series of head expressions carved in plaster of Paris. My mother made the charming costumes, and my father constructed the armature. I cannot recall the details of the script because it has been lost, or even if I made a test of the concept. I must have been serious about the project, or I wouldn't have gone to all the trouble of building an animated figure and carving the multiple heads. Another character that never got beyond the idea stage was the Frog Prince, a children's tale I remembered reading many years ago. As I recall, there was a great deal of charm in the story. I do not believe I ever developed a screen adaptation, but I did make one drawing. David and Goliath was also developed in two drawings. I probably abandoned it after realizing there would be far too many animated characters to contend with for a short 16mm film. H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds was one of my favorite stories. The following is a test I made on 16mm film of the Martian emerging from a crashed rocket ship, as vividly described by Wells. I wanted to add a traveling mat of people in the foreground, but finally realized it was not practical to do it on 16mm film. Unfortunately, my conception was never produced. The test you are about to see was made in the 1950s, a few years after I worked on Mighty Joe Young. After the completion of The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, I developed a story outline of about 3 pages called The Elementals. To encourage interest in the project, I decided to make a test animation sequence to illustrate the project's feasibility and add to the presentation. Financing it myself and serving as cameraman, actor, and editor, I made a 5-minute 35mm color test. The live action for the test was shot locally on the brow of a hill against the skyline, and whilst my father operated the camera, I stood on the hill waving a large stick as though protecting myself from the creature which only I could visualize as attacking me. Back in my hobby house, having constructed an armatured model of both the creature and myself, I animated it on wires to correspond with my arm movements. And as a climax, I had the creature carry me, a model of course, off into the sunset. There were a number of other stories I wanted to develop, but few of them came to the production stage. These efforts are described in more detail in Ray Harryhausen, An Animated Life. Computer animation today seems to dominate the field of entertainment, but I still believe there is room for every known technique depending on the type of tale to be told. After all, the main reason for putting anything on the silver screen is to entertain. The method used in this process is always secondary to a good, comprehensive visual story.